Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Monero and Christianity. We're about to do a deep dive here, once again with the famous Alaskanon. And today we're hoping to cover some objections to Monero, but also uncover maybe the roots of cryptocurrency itself and lots of other shenanigans. So, Alaska, how are you doing?
Having a great day, man.
Well, I don't know about you, Alaskanon, but whenever talking to other Christians about Monero, and usually people who can see technocracy and the dangers of that political, economic, and religious system encroaching the world, I think people's natural first inclination is to use cash. And you kind of hear this expression used quite a lot: "Cash is king."
hmm
I disagree. I actually don't think cash is a great system. It's
I
good in that
think
it has
Jesus is
privacy.
king, but
Yeah, yeah, Christ is king.
hmm
But I understand why people want to use cash because it has an element of privacy. But the dangers I see with something like cash is that one, it's still part of the fiat system, and they can just print money out of nothing and just devalue your currency. And the other thing is that there's nothing stopping the banking system from stopping you from withdrawing cash, right? So if you are going to your ATM and you're about to withdraw some cash, they can just turn that off. So it doesn't stop with debanking, and it's still tied to digital systems. So I think that's the disadvantage of cash. But is that something that you've heard yourself?
Oh, of course, I've heard it before, and I would certainly not tell somebody to evade tools that might be useful in their particular situation, especially when such a nearly Orwellian control of the world of economics is controlled by the use of the dollar, and at least you can use the dollar privately with cash. But the problem with cash is you're giving the Federal Reserve control over the supply on half of every transaction. So whatever it is that you're buying, the price control on the buy side is the value of the dollar. And then the other thing is we know that it's a debt note. So anything that is a debt note, the people who issue the debt control the money supply, and we know what the Bible says about debt and using debt, especially in financial transactions. My biggest concern is when people talk about, oh well, if I have dollars, and I have cash dollars, that means that I still have access to the dollar system. Well, that's true right now, but most people, when they talk about a CBDC, and if the dollar became a CBDC, they're not totally aware of the implications of exactly what that means, because even the well-educated ones will think of it in terms of, oh well, if you sit on your dollars too long, they can basically delete them, like prevent you from having savings. Well, most people don't think of the other side of the implications of that, which is, people aren't calculating in their heads how many dollars they have. They're thinking of it in terms of spending power, and the bank can just relay that information directly to you. Well, what if having your dollars parked in a bank, you were getting a crazy yield on it? So, for example, like every day that you have dollars in the bank, you get 7% or some crazy amount. They don't even have to eliminate the use of cash. They can just debase it into oblivion, while people who are in the banking system are getting these crazy yields on their cash, and then make it hard to withdraw cash, like you were saying. And then it's functionally useless whether or not they get rid of it.
Yes.
So as soon as you tie your value, your asset value, to anything involving dollars, you have still given control over to the powers that be. But the privacy implications, absolutely, they're great for now, but they're not really that great, because they still go into what is effectually a centralized exchange, and they come out of a centralized exchange. So if I pull out cash and I spend it at a vendor and they immediately deposit that cash, it's really not that hard to figure out where it came from. It's just not what people think it is when they're trying to escape the technocracy. I'm not telling people don't use cash. Certainly use the tools that you have at your disposal to protect your privacy. But this is not the answer that people are looking for. It's definitely not.
Yeah, and I think as Christians, we want to use economic systems which are biblical, and dishonest weights and scales are an abomination to God. And the fiat system is an abomination to God. So Christians should be seeking to exit the fiat system, not trying to find alternatives or within that kind of system itself. And we've seen examples of this here in the UK. I know there was a video that was going viral on Twitter or X recently of a gentleman who wanted to withdraw, I believe it was £5,000 to £10,000 from his bank account, and the bank wouldn't allow him.
Can I have a word with you?
I'm now in Santander Bank, right?
What are you doing, sir?
I'm filming you and I'm recording this conversation. I'm coming to the bank to withdraw £2,500. Are you going to let me? I've got £11,500 in my account. Are you going to let me? Are you going to let me have the money or not? Hello, are you going to let me have the money or not? Huh?
I can't remove that restriction that's on there.
You can't remove this restriction. You can't remove the restriction, okay. After your colleague told me I'm a liar, yeah? So your colleague told me I'm a liar yesterday. I've come in to withdraw £2,500, yeah? And you're not going to let me have my money today, is that right?
Right, you can still use your card.
I'm not, answer the question please, yeah? I can still use my card. Are you going to let me withdraw £2,500 from my account today, yes or no, in the branch?
And what is the £2,500 for, Mr. Jackson?
Buying a motorbike for my son.
Right, okay, so have you got any evidence of the motorbike you
No, I haven't got any evidence of a motorbike at all, no, I haven't got it, 'cause I don't know what one I'm getting yet.
Okay, so if you don't know what you're getting, how do you know how much you need?
Because I've got a budget of £2,500 for the motorbike, so that's why I want to withdraw £2,500 from my account today.
Right,
Yeah.
so when you find the bike for your son, if you can show us some evidence of that.
So you're not. So I need to show you evidence. So I need to show you evidence. I'm doing it.
Video call of this.
Really?
You can't
now.
film me without my permission, sir. You
Really?
cannot film
Right.
me.
So you're not going to give me the money, no?
I'm gonna hang up this immediately.
Absolute joke,
Okay,
this
I'm gonna
place.
call the security.
Absolute joke. You're an absolute joke, this place. Won't let me draw.
They're telling him what he can and can't do with his own money. And we're going to see this more and more as the technocratic surveillance control grid wraps around people, is that you're not going to have the ability to use cash in the same ways as you can currently use it today. So thinking of alternatives such as Monero, such as things like this, silver, is something that I think can be very useful. This is a coin that I got from the Royal Mint here in the UK. It has all the etchings of officialdom. And I think something like silver on top of Monero could be a very powerful alternative economic system for people.
There's like
to
an
use
Irish
leverage.
version of the goldback too. I forget what they're called, but they're absolutely amazing. Goldbacks are very divisible, very fixed. One contention that I have with people who say it's my money and I want to withdraw it. No, when you make a bank account, you agree to be an unsecured creditor. So it's actually not your money.
Yeah.
It stopped being your money when you put it in a bank.
Yes.
Now that might be a horrible system, but that's kind of the whole point of this show, right? Is to explain to people like, yeah, it's a horrible system. It's fundamentally broken. It's an abomination to God. You know, there are things that may not be super clear when you're reading the Bible. For example, it can be difficult to really nail down whether or not an ostrich is an unclean animal. But I don't think God leaves a whole lot of room for interpretation on how he feels about debt and dishonest financial systems.
And theft.
And yeah, and theft, and all of the lying that goes along with it, and funding genocides and so on. So I think that people just need to get to the root of the issue, which is, yeah, I guess you play stupid games, win stupid prizes, right? So the goal needs to be firmly focused on exiting the system, building something that's not an affront to everything that God stands for, and trying to get in it as quickly as possible. Now there are things in the Bible that temper how quickly you make those decisions, right? So you should be trying to leave an inheritance for your children's children. God calls that a wise man. And you shouldn't, put all of your wealth into some risk asset, which Monero, I mean, I would point out it's a lot less of a risk asset than most other, actually basically all other cryptos, but it doesn't change the fact that it is a risk asset. Like there's land and there's, tools, and there's all kinds of other ways that you can preserve your wealth and the purchasing power of your actual physical labor. But that said, piling up a giant hoard of fiat Fed notes, whichever country you may be from, is definitely not a biblical way to look at money.
Absolutely. So I think the other kind of maybe the other side of the coin, to use financial terminology,
Pun intended.
yeah, pun intended, of cash is king, is that there seems to be a skepticism between of anything digital, and I often
Mhm.
hear the objection of, well, they can. What if the power goes out, or they control the internet? And I think this is an intrinsic skepticism of digital currencies because of CBDCs. So I think a lot of this comes to misunderstandings of what cryptocurrencies are, something like Monero. But do you want to speak into that? Because that's an objection I certainly hear. I'm sure you hear it as well. What's
Mhm.
your sort of response to people who say, "Well, what if the power goes out? They can control the internet. They can shut it down at any time." What would you say in response to that?
Um, Oddly enough, this reminds me of the abortion debate. And I know that they don't seem related at first until you've had a lot of these conversations. So, yeah, it's probably pretty obvious that I'm staunchly opposed to the idea that abortion isn't like the most morally abhorrent, awful thing that people could possibly do. So I'll wear my bias on my sleeve here. But the thing is when you're having a discussion with somebody about abortion, the first thing that they always want to go to is, what if it's a disabled baby about to be birthed by a sick mother who was like R word that you can't use on YouTube. And the first thing that I like to do when I'm having those conversations is, okay, I will go here, but I want you to first acknowledge that well over half of all abortions are for economic reasons. And then the vast majority of the rest of it is an issue of convenience. So we are talking about like 0.01% of this argument. And I want to say the same thing to people who talk about what if the power goes out, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so first off, is most of your money already in an electronic transaction system? Are you already just using credit and debit cards? What's the difference? Power goes out, they're worthless, right? So are you currently practicing what you're preaching? You're worried about the power going out. And it's not like you can't have some fiat Fed notes in your wallet but also make the switch to Monero. If the power goes out and you need to use cash, the thing is the thing you're probably buying, you still can't get it for cash if the power goes out. The power going out usually doesn't last that long. And then more importantly than all of that is if the power goes out for a prolonged period of time, what exactly do you expect to be able to do with your fiat? You see, like you're in a different realm of reality altogether. But that said, as long as they'll first acknowledge that it's kind of a ridiculous thing to start arguing the merits of whether or not this financial system is better than the other or what, because the power doesn't really go out very much. And if it does, you usually have bigger problems and there's usually other options. And it's not like you can't still have a hand recorded ledger or whatever. But more importantly, there are actually systems that mitigate this problem. So it's in the name. I'm Alaskanon. I live in Alaska. I'm pretty sure my power goes out more than whoever's asking me, unless they also live here. And you actually get that question less here than you do other places because they're so used to dealing with the power going out that they've already kind of in their head figured out systems for. And if you're talking to a prepper who's like, oh, I want my money to go places when the power goes out, it's like, aren't you the same guy that's holed up in your house with a bunch of rations and you're waiting for everything to blow over? And like, but were you going to go out there and just start swiping that debit card for the latest movie tickets or whatever? Like, of course not. It's not. It's not I'm sure the people making the argument are genuine, but you're really more addressing the uncertainty of the fact that they don't know how cryptocurrency works rather than the genuine concern of the power going out. But some of the papers that we were going to discuss later, if time allows, There have been solutions for using cryptocurrencies offline since like 1987. Now, I was born about 1987, so basically that's almost 40 years now that people have had solutions for using digital payments offline. These questions have been tackled for a very, very long time now. Um, and then the other thing is there's already hardware wallet features that allow you to make transactions offline. There's already other solutions for how you can at least commune a trade offline. And then people say, oh, well, I'm losing some of the trustless blah blah blah. Well, yeah, with some of the systems, not all of them. But the other thing is, usually in a power outage situation, like you either unite with your neighbors or things get pretty nasty pretty fast. And they're probably already scoping out the idea of coming and robbing you. So it's just not a genuine argument for making the switch. That's not to say the people aren't genuine. It's just not a practical question to be asking when there's more things that line up with our day-to-day reality that are of concern. The banks will tell you you can't withdraw cash whether or not the power is out. There's counterparty risk for basically everything but gold and some cryptocurrencies, whether or not the power is out. So I'm talking about you having access to your money all the time. And you're asking me whether or not you will have access to your money less than 1% of the time. And that's where I like to take the conversation. And then if they're still curious, you can show them different ways that you can use crypto transactions offline and stuff. But why bother? Because you haven't even made the switch yet. So like maybe start with the 99% and then we'll start moving to the 0.01s as they pile up.
Yeah, I think it comes down to people's understanding of the problem, and they see the solution. They see the problem is surveillance, and digital prison. So the solution is physical things, and it's cash. So I think when you understand technocracy, and it has really three goals, and one is that it needs the internet, one it needs surveillance, and then three it needs censorship. So the first point is that technocracy needs the internet. So the response to that is, well, you either use physical things or you use peer-to-peer encrypted communication channels. This is the same thing that happens with point two. Technocracy needs surveillance. Again, the inverse of this. Well, if this is a system based on surveillance, within the opposing force is privacy and anonymity. So protecting your identity is going to be crucial, I think, now, but also in the future towards this technocratic system. And then finally, censorship, because one of the goals of technocracy is the science of social engineering, is to control the perception of reality in order to influence people's behavior. And they do this through censorship by hiding certain information. They can get people to believe certain things which are not true. So therefore, I think the opposing force to censorship is encrypted communications or physical interaction. So this is why church is, I think, it's going to become so important, both now and in the future. Meeting face to face, and we even have this in Hebrews, right? Do not forsake the assembly of yourselves as you see the day approaching. And I think that's crucial as we see more and more things on the internet being untrustworthy, unreliable, and the need for encrypted communications and face to face interactions. So yeah, I think a lot of these objections come from.
That's
Sorry, go
also
ahead.
why they spend so much time and effort trying to break the church and sowing sowing discord amongst the brethren. There's a reason why, and it's because the gathering of the assembly, and and even like you should be gathering with your church outside of your church as well. It's not like, oh, I'm done, Sunday's over, like we're good now. The premise is to build like a camaraderie for exactly what you're discussing. And people are like, how am I going to figure out what is and isn't true when everything on the internet can be AI generated? It's like, well, they haven't figured out how to AI generate like a flesh and blood human being sitting down with you for coffee. And the reason you're scared of that is because you're not following the teachings that you can find in Hebrews. It's because you're not making it to church. You're not making, and honestly, like, I don't go to church every Sunday. Well, for one, I keep Sabbath, but for two, like, for me, church is Bible study. Church is the congregation of the same and the thing is you should be gathering with your brethren so frequently that, like, church isn't a means by which you meet your quota. Like, you should see these people and interact with them and trust them so deeply that it's a weird day when you haven't at least heard from the people in your Bible study, when it's like the next time I'm going to meet him is 2 days from now, because I think, Miss so and so down the road needs help with mowing the grass. Or but the sense of camaraderie is dying for a reason. It's because it's right up there with the destruction of the family, right? In fact, they're not very different. It's pretty much the same exact reason. If you can get husbands to fight with their wives, and if you can get the Bible study to argue about, what's the proper translation of Yahshua, right? Like, you'll quickly erode the foundations of their ability to defend themselves from tyranny. Gathering, I honestly, it's kind of depressing how little people care about gathering at this point with their brethren.
And I think that part of that has been a deliberate agenda to replace physical communities with internet communities. So people now go online to kind of get this kind of vicarious sense of community and belonging with internet groups, either it's subreddits or Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups. And this is kind of where they're getting their kind of emotional needs met from a community standpoint, when all those desires, I believe, were God intended, he baked into humanity to be expressed in the local gathering of believers in the church. So that's something to be aware of, that a lot of these communities is an attack on the church, frankly. And I think that's something that Christians need to be aware of. And it is important to have these face-to-face interactions. And this is why I'm so kind of excited about printed media. So, here I've got these business cards. They all have different purposes of getting people to think about, biblical economics, essentially. And they're so helpful because so much of the internet is censored. You try to post something, the reach is limited. There's all these, you're competing with all the adult content, you're competing with all the sensationalism, you're competing with just all the degeneracy on the internet, and it's very difficult to break through that, particularly when people can fake it until they make it, and they can present themselves in a certain way which they seem to be more authoritative, and that you're also dealing with all those other things. So I do think the idea of having physical things, both in having a solution like silver, like having something physical, but also face-to-face interactions, is how we combat this satanic economic system. So,
it's amazing how those two tie together also, where people are like, oh, if the power goes out, how I'm going to spend my money. And it's like, that's only a concern when you're not working together with your community. It's like if Nancy across the street has a garden and you're raising sheep or whatever, and then you have a guy down the road that can make fuels and diesel, and it's like the power going out thing that we mentioned earlier, it kind of like exposes how weak their sense of community has become as well. It's now to the point where most people, like, they don't know which neighbor they can go over to ask for a cup of sugar. Right? Remember how that was the meme, like when we were kids, go ask the so-and-so for a cup of sugar. And it's like, how many people, it's not their first choice to be like, oh, I'm out of sugar, let me drive all the way down to the grocery store because I don't have someone within walking distance that can give me just a cup of sugar to keep cooking. Like, I wanted to bake this pie, but now I have to drive 10 miles, 10 miles where I live, but it's like, it's the community is dying. You can see it from just the memes. Yes. And it's our fault, right? Like, we're not keeping them alive the way that we should.
And I think as Christians, we should be attentive to the needs of our brothers and sisters. If someone came into your church and, they were naked, we're told to clothe them. If they're hungry, we're to feed them. If they have financial troubles, we're to help them. And there's this element of holding all things in common that I think we need to start thinking about. It's like holy communism. Yeah. Right. So there's an element where we must hold things in common. We must hold our possessions lightly because it all belongs to God anyway. And if there's a brother and sister who has a need, then we must be willing and able to help them if we are able to first meet our own needs. The Bible says, very clearly in Corinthians at the end there, to give from your increase. So you must be able to meet your own needs as a family. He doesn't provide for his household, has denied the faith. But then I think that's another scripture as well, because if you're to give from your increase, you first have to have a tally. You have to know what your expenses are and be able to meet your needs, and then with confidence be able to help others. It's like Jesus said, take the plank out of your own eye before you take the speck of your brother's eye. There's no point in trying to financially help somebody else if you yourself aren't able to meet your financial needs. So,
Well, how many times does the Bible tell you to count the cost of something?
yeah.
Everything from war to whether or not, different actions on your property make sense. The Bible always tells you to take account of the cost of a thing.
So we've covered some objections. I suppose the other objection we have is, well, they control the internet and they can just, turn it off at any time. And I suppose that kind of falls within the same purview of, well, they control the, electric grid and can turn that off at any time.
Oh,
So
they
what
absolutely have a pretty strong control over the internet. There's been huge advances in freedom software. There's been little advances in freedom hardware, and there's been virtually zero advances in free communication systems like worldwide communication systems. That said, you got things like mesh nets, you have things like encrypted channels, Tor, I2P, these other things, which do work.
SSTV?
Yeah,
Or
there are
through
ways.
radio?
Yeah, and I'd point out that there's ways to to make a Monero network through radio transmissions. And I mean, it's definitely not the best, but it works. But one of the things about doing homework when you're looking at ARPANET, they're using encrypted transactions that are basically what people think of as Bitcoin today. Everything that Bitcoin is, they were doing in the early 80s. In fact, pretty much exactly what Bitcoin is, they were doing by like 89, 91. And that was using computers that, had 25,000 transistors compared to multiple millions with clock frequencies of 12 megahertz instead of 4 gigahertz, right? And so the thing is it is possible to make your own network that isn't connected to the internet, or just like a tech savvy individual is connecting to the internet and, communicating with the nodes of other people who are tech savvy. There are ways, and I think with need, more effective solutions will emerge. But there's already people thinking about it. Like on Monero Talk, there was like a 12-year-old Chinese boy trying to make a project for how you could launch your own satellites and have a parallel internet in case they tried to shut down the internet and Monero transactions still needed to go through. I mean, the next generation is thinking really hard about this. But I think it's out of economic and practical convenience, the reason why people still continue to use the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 systems that govern the way that the internet is run, which is giving the technocrats and the powers that be kind of an advantage on getting ahead of the curve with locking down the internet. But that doesn't mean that that's the only option. And that also doesn't mean that if the need were to arise, you wouldn't be able to rapidly construct these parallel systems. You can already buy basically fake cell phone towers. The police use them all the time, for their nefarious purposes. But the point is you can get those kinds of things and build your own cellular network in your neighborhood. There's always a way. It's just because of how convenient it is now, it's not a problem that most people are currently tackling. But as soon as they start shutting down the internet, think of what the enemy has to lose. That's how they keep you from going to church, right? Like we were just discussing. That's how they keep you, being force fed this media garbage all the time. Honestly, if the cost of losing all of that was to give up on Monero, I think we still came out ahead. It's like I that wouldn't bother me at all. So
and that's a valid point, because technocracy needs the internet. So I don't think we're going to see a day where the internet disappears. They need it. And as you said, it serves their purposes in keeping people goonified. I do think adult content has been weaponized. And there's really three things I think have been weaponized: video games, social media, and adult content, because they all stimulate the same parts of the brain. and condition people to rely on pleasure pain responses and reduce their moral principles. And people with low moral character are easier to control with technology. And I think this is part of the agenda. And Christianity stands in direct opposition of that, because it says, no, I will not bow and worship the golden statue. No matter how much social engineering you throw in my face, I'm not going to do it. So I do see Christianity as the arch enemy of the satanic technocratic state.
Probably the only real enemy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I reject humanism and all of its manifestations. Alaskanon, before we go into the deep dive into the kind of original cryptocurrencies, are there any other objections that you have heard that we haven't addressed yet?
Oh, the easiest one by far, and I think the one that's most grounded in reality, is how do I get it? And the more I think about this question, the more fascinating it becomes to me. So people always, once they're like, yeah, let me get some Monero, then their next question is, how do I buy it? And they want to use fiat and they want to get themselves some Monero. Now, that said, there are ways to get Monero for fiat, especially if you're willing to make the compromise of a centralized exchange, or which I'm not recommending. In fact, I would strongly not recommend it. But in my opinion, the best way to get Monero is to trade goods, services, labor, and so on, and just make those things available to people who are willing to spend Monero. And then there's other ways to make sure that what you're doing is legal and safe for you in the country that you're in, because it's different from place to place. But if you're willing to be an on and off ramp for Monero, it's a really easy way to get your hands on a steady supply of Monero. And it kind of has this added benefit of it helps you dollar cost average in and out. Because if you're always offering to be the on and off ramp for Monero, then you're going to find yourself accumulating at price intervals, both down and up. And it helps you get not necessarily a good price, but a fair price over time. Never do more than you're willing to lose with any of these things. But you could say the same thing about the dollar, by the way. The savers have been punished if in fiat terms for the last 50 years, but nobody seems to have a problem with being punished for saving money if it's fiat. Well, I would say the same thing about Monero. Make sure you're diversified and considerate of the needs of your own family. But it's access to the Monero ecosystem at the point of entry that I hear the most complaints about. And they're well-founded, they're valid complaints. But I would also point out, isn't it odd that people who have Monero aren't trying to leave Monero for fiat? You don't find that with, it has its own derogatory term, but let's call them meme coins, right? You don't see meme coin pumpers hodling to the moon, right? But Monero people, their reluctance to trade it for fiat is pretty strong. Now, they'll buy and sell stuff with it, but they usually don't want to get in and out of the fiat system if they have it. And it kind of shows you that they practice what they preach. So that's definitely the big one. And I don't really have like great answers other than to say, be willing to accept Monero and be willing to be an on and off ramp for Monero. And then depending on the legalities in your own country and your risk tolerance for the thing, make it public that you're willing to do that. If as far as you can tell, it's safe and legal to say, I will accept Monero for certain amounts of cash so I can get my hands on it, then be willing to do that, and you can find yourself holding Monero.
Well, I think as we move into a world which says eating meat is a crime, or having raw milk or free-range eggs, I think we'll be less concerned about legalities in the future as we move closer to clown world.
It's good to have some practice too.
Right? Yes, and a network.
Yes, exactly.
And that's what I love about Monero, because when you start transacting with Monero, you start meeting people who are very similar mind, and it's a great networking ability to meet similar people or similar businesses that have the same values or something that is along those lines. They understand the problem. They see the need for alternative economic systems.
They're
So
good people to know. Trust me, they're very good people to know.
yeah, and they're early adopters, right? So a lot of advantages. So I think we've covered quite a few objections. If there's any more objections that listeners have, please let us know in the comments. We can then reply to them individually. But now I think it's important to really go into the origins of cryptocurrency itself. I know you've done a lot of research into this. I've done some research into this. So something that I was brought to my attention actually by Patrick Wood, who was on a previous episode about economic totalitarianism, the kind of the research of technocracy. And one of his skepticisms of cryptocurrency is because the NSA wrote a white paper called How to Make a Mint in the early 90s or late 90s, I believe, and it was by the NSA. So there's a strong tie to US intelligence, cryptographic technology, and obviously cryptocurrency. So I think that is enough to make people kind of back off. But you got to be careful you don't commit a genetic fallacy, right?
Yeah.
Intelligence communities can actually produce useful things, and no, not everyone in the intelligence community serve Satan. They are whistleblowers. They are people who leave the system. They are people who maybe create technologies that undermine things that they see popping up. So I think you have to be aware of that, but I don't think it should scare people off either. I think there's enough there to say, actually, no, this is useful for now and it works. So I'm going to confidently go into it. But tell us a little bit about
with
your
the Christian audience about that. I would point out the most passionate servants of Jesus are usually people who left something that's passionately antithetical to everything Jesus stands for.
true.
Like former
Yes.
Luciferians make diehard Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Ex-Muslims make diehard Christians. It's so we see that in the ministry world all the time. And I mean, if you believe that Paul is a divinely inspired individual, I mean, does it get more like
Satanic.
came from the one and moved to the other, right? Well,
Mhm.
Paul is my hero, and I know that it's become popular in the Christian world to hate on Paul in certain circles, but it's like, I mean, have you read the guy? Like, come on, it's as far as like general Bible reading, it's some of my favorite stuff because there's just so much meat there. There's so much to chew on. And the genetic fallacy it's a doozy because a lot of us in this space have been trained to be distrustful and rightfully so, but actually the genetic fallacy doesn't apply with the NSA How to Make a Mint anyway, if you dig a little deeper than most people are willing to do. So real quick, the only named author as far as like an actual author for How to Make a Mint is Dr. Tatsuki Okamoto, is kind of named because he's been de-anonymized, but the other one is Thomas P. Vartanian, and he actually printed his name on the How to Make a Mint thing, the paper. Well, he's just aggregating data, and he's an NSA expert. So in other words, his job at the NSA is to learn and understand and describe these things and make that data available within like big government circles and so on. But he's citing stuff that is way older than all of that. Some of the papers that he cites in How to Make a Mint are from like 1977 or 1971. I mean, at this point, that paper came out in 96, the How to Make a Mint paper. I mean, he was closer to our time than he was to the original documentation for how to make cryptocurrency work. So that's like the distance that we're speculating today on his time is the distance that he was speculating on stuff that had already been running for quite a while. The cypherpunk movement goes way back. Like these concepts go way back before the How to Make a Mint thing. It's kind of like the government wrestling with a certain inevitability of where this whole thing is going to go, you know. So and I get it, you know, but that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to get this community to understand, like, you can go back a lot further, like a lot further than how to make a mint.
Well, I'd argue you could go in terms of modern day intelligence. You can go back to the Reformation, because the modern U.S. intelligence, if you go, so we start with the CIA, for example. You go back to the
OSS.
OSS, and the OSS was really formed by the British Security Coordination, led by William Stevenson, who was the spy master of the British during World War II, and they had a base in New York at the Rockefeller Center of all places, and they were the ones who trained the U.S. intelligence, because the U.S. didn't, before World War II, didn't have an international intelligence agency. They had the FBI, which was, you know, for their own state. So it was really the British who trained the US on how to do intelligence. And the British have a long history of an intelligentsia, which goes back to the Reformation. So it goes back to Francis Walsingham and the Cecils, Robert and William Cecil, who under Elizabeth and then King James were the spy masters that really defended the nation from the globalists of their time, right? It was the Roman Catholic Antichrist system that was sending in Jesuits who were spies who were trying to subvert the nation. And you couldn't drop a pin in England without the spy masters having connections and finding. So, and they needed that because they were under such threat from all the surrounding nations and all these superpowers surrounding them. It's like, it'd be like the equivalent of, I know, being in Alaska and having Russia and America trying to like invade Alaska. Well, you need a pretty robust spy agency if you're going to survive. And it came out of necessity. And it was really these principles and the system that kind of was birthed out of a Protestant Reformation, the desire to disconnect themselves from Rome, have an independent nation, have a church that wasn't connected to Rome, and also an economy that wasn't connected to Rome, that these spy masters were developed. And I think a lot of these techniques refined, which then over the periods of time, obviously, leads to the establishment of America and then the American Intelligence Agency. So if you're going to go all the way back, I actually think the roots of a lot of this is to do with biblical Christianity and a need to keep secrets and have robust encryption so that you can further righteousness on the earth. I think over time these systems have been corrupted and now serve Satan. But I think there's a point in history where I think you can actually go back and, well, these were actually just systems that were necessary in order to further righteousness on the earth. So sorry to derail that, but in terms of just answering that genetic fallacy, I think you can, if you keep on going back, you can actually make an argument that the entire intelligentsia has its roots in the Protestant religion. But besides that, I know you've done a lot of research into the founding of, I suppose, digital cash. Tell us what you've uncovered and how is this relevant to the kind of adoption of Monero?
So as far as doing something for the context of this show, because it just gets so deep and it's so vast, I actually thought it would be kind of cool to focus on just one particular man. There's a gentleman by the name of David Chaum. And David Chaum, his technical prowess and following the history of this man, even to the present day, you can tell he's kind of wrapping up his career at this point. So it's almost the perfect time to look at the life's work of this guy. So I want to just read some excerpts from a paper that he wrote. So this paper, it's called Security Without Identification, Transaction Systems to Make Big Brother Obsolete. So, and you'll find a pattern in his work, which is he does work with some of the, let's just call it the Orwellian superstate or whatever. But this guy never shakes the whole cypherpunk ethos, even in the work that he's doing for the government. It's cool what he calls himself, because he's in computer science philosophy. And he's a very talented cryptographer, and he's a very talented economist and so on. But he's very interested in the philosophy. So if you take the Security Without Identification paper that he wrote in October of 1985, I'm gonna summarize the middle of it because it is kind of lengthy, but I think it is important to read pretty much the entire first paragraph and then the lengthy last paragraph to get a feel for what this guy is actually like. So at the very end of his paper, Security Without Identification, Transaction Systems Make Big Brother Obsolete, there's a section called Future Implications. So this is, he's done with the crypto talk, he's done with the math, he's done with all of that stuff, and now he is trying to summarize what he believes the future implications in 1985, so 40 years ago. Okay. This man says, large-scale automated transaction systems are imminent. He was definitely right about that. The architecture chosen for these systems may have long-term impacts on the centralization of our economic system, on some of our basic liberties, and even on our democracy. The initial choice of direction will gather economic and social momentum, making reversal increasingly less likely. Economic centralization may be furthered under the current approach. So he's saying that there is like a weight behind the first mover. And he's also saying that depending on which system you choose, you may end up with huge
Irreversible.
effects on freedom and economics and so on. And then the summary of the next paragraph is basically he talks about privacy concerns surrounding big business and telecom providers, which is one thing that you brought up, where, you know, what happens if they shut down the internet and so on. And he does address a lot of that. And then the next really big paragraph, once again, I'm summarizing a huge chunk of this, so the last part will make the most sense. David expresses potential solutions to the problem with decentralization and also, to a lesser extent, the problem with centralization. And then the next paragraph, he discusses the problems with privacy in a centralized model. And he kind of proposes the fact that there really isn't a solution for privacy in a centralized model that he can think of anyway. Then he discusses what pseudonymity is and how you can fix security and privacy problem at the same time using cryptography. And actually his later work does, I would, in my opinion, an even much greater job at kind of squaring that circle, so to speak. And then he speculates on how people would respond to either one of the parallel models. And then you have this really lengthy end paragraph, and I apologize for its lack of brevity, but I really think that we shouldn't take it out of context, which is sophisticated marketing techniques that rely on profiles of individuals, sound familiar, are now being used, 1985, okay, are now being used to manipulate public opinion and elections. The potential exists not only for reversing these problems, but for increasing democratization. For instance, with the kinds of systems presented here, multi-party secure election and polling could be conveniently conducted without centralized coordination and without those expressing their views able to show relevant credentials. Advances in information technology have always been accompanied by major changes in society. The written transition from tribal to larger hierarchical forms, for example, was accompanied by written language, and printing technology helped to foster the emergence of large-scale democracies. Coupling computers to telecommunications technologies creates what has been called the ultimate medium. It certainly is a big step up from paper. One might ask, to what forms of society could this new technology lead? The two, he numbers it, the two approaches appear to hold quite different answers. So, in the opinion of the man who invented the future of cryptography, way back in 1985, he's basically telling you that there are two options: privacy and decentralization, or transparency and centralization. And he is juxtaposing those two as one is the big brother technocracy nightmare fuel straight out of Revelation kind of thing. And the other one is human liberty on a scale that we haven't known in at least quite some time, but with all the modern conveniences and trimmings. So I wrote a little thing here to kind of couch in people's minds. So that paper is from 1985. ARPANET was officially operational in 1971. And we'll talk about ARPANET a little bit, but there should probably be a whole show about it. But ARPANET is effectively the internet, not even 1.0, but like 0.5 or something like that. And it was officially operational in 1971, and it was passed to the DCA, not Naval Intelligence, not the CIA, in 1975. This paper cites David's earlier work in 1976, demonstrating the development of early cryptographic payment solutions, and that was 50 years ago. So he had already laid the groundwork for what basically everything that Bitcoin is already existed by this paper in 1985. And it was really more about kind of cleaning up around the edges. And then one
Well,
other
what's interesting about the ARPANET, if I could just make a little pit stop, is that this is really where you start seeing these technocratic philosophies being implemented in large scale.
Yes.
So the ARPANET really came out of the Vietnam War, where they were using surveillance techniques in order to try, work out the Ho Chi Minh Trail and to have devices where they could sort of automate bombing sequences. And
Mhm.
even in a book called The Manchurian Candidate, they started using like MK Ultra type experimentation on the Viet Cong. I know one project was Operation Bluebird, and the goal was to make people, tweet, which is ironic. So you start seeing these techniques of social engineering and surveillance uh, in the terms of technical operations within combatants being used in the Vietnam War, I think almost as a testing ground to then bring it into the global section. So this is kind of where the ARPANET's birthed, and then we're now leading it here. A group that was instrumental behind this is called the Jasons, and they sort of are this kind of a think tank of different scientific experts that solve problems for the government intelligence agency, usually from universities and things. So
And
there's
to back up what you're saying, by the way, like they started what you're describing in these think tanks and university labs that had private funding and all that other stuff. But when they started seeking public funding and government funding in multiple nations, by the way, was from 1961 to 1964. You see them start collecting these massive sums of wealth, especially for the time, to launch projects like ARPANET. So even though it's officially operational in 1971, they're collecting public funds for launching this 10 years earlier. And they were already playing with these ideas in these think tanks before the Vietnam War even started. So you can see that, the origins of technocracy are deep indeed. But you can see how David Chaum, a person who is aware of what's going on here, he's clearly taking a position of like the antithesis to the technocracy. Why don't we take all of these benefits but eliminate the whole big brother side of things? It's fascinating. It really is. Like before we were even born, peace was never an option, I guess is what I'm getting at right now.
Well, it's always been the the cypherpunks versus the technocrats.
Yes, in whatever various forms of the era, but it never ends, right? It's Jesus versus the devil. There's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
And so the next one that I wanted to bring up is actually, it predates the one that I just described, but I just thought it was a really good way to lead into this. Like what the thinking of this man is very well revealed in his future implications part on that paper. But his dissertation for his PhD, and actually what he's famous for in like the Bitcoin history researcher crowd, it was called Computer Systems Established, Maintained, and Trusted by Mutually Suspicious Groups. So titling papers is not this man's strong suit, as you can see, and it gets worse actually. But so it's a dissertation, and the submission was approved on the 4th of April, 1982. And
But he wrote it in 79, did he not?
yes, well, I guess you could say started writing. It's the dissertations take a while, right?
Okay.
The submission being approved just basically says this meets your requirement for your PhD. So, but yes, it goes. And actually, he had been working on it for like a very long time up until this point. It's kind of the culmination of all of his university work, which I mean, that's 8 years. So I guess you could almost say that this started in 74. But it probably wasn't nearly what it ended up being in 74. But so he's working on this for a very long time, and then it gets approved as like the work submitted for his PhD in 1982. So that's basically when this becomes public record, like this paper is finished, give me my degree kind of thing. Okay. And it by the way, it does become publicly available. Yeah, I think you're right. In 79 is when people are now reading this and checking the work and so on. So the concepts outlined in the paper cover cryptography and algorithms, keys and pseudonymity, device security, organizational structures, and a very rudimentary blockchain system. They're called vaults. But if you replace the vaults with blocks, they're clearly the same thing. I would point out that it was probably just a lack of understanding of where technology would go that undergoes like the largest amount of change between this paper and Bitcoin. But
Okay.
even like the framework of how you use these settled transaction layers to build on the next one is built with this vaults concept. And he acknowledges that it's like a core part of the architecture and it doesn't become immutable without it. And then he goes into nodes, the proofs, and the mechanisms for privacy. Um, in fact, even the people who would then go on to come up with the modern zero knowledge proofs will draw heavily from the work found in this paper. So by 1982, that's Bitcoin. Like the whole thing is there.
Yeah.
And then the same gentleman, David Chaum, so he creates a company called DigiCash. And if only the Bitcoin maxis knew their history about DigiCash, we would not be having the same conversations that we have today. So he founded this company, David Chaum, in 1990, and it would go on to make a micropayment system using eCash at one US bank from 1995 to 1998. In June of 1998, eCash became available through Credit Suisse in Switzerland. It was available from Deutsche Bank in Germany, the Bank of Austria, Sweden's Posten A and B. I could name all of the. It's a lot of banks, and they're big banks. So I'll skip to the part where. But transactions were not freely available to purchasers in a lot of these. But in Finland, for example, Merita Bank made eCash available to the general public. They weren't the only one, but it's to give you an idea, like the banks are trying to hoard this technology for itself. Sound familiar? It should. All right. And there are a few banks that are kind of breaking rank, and there are a few groups of people that see the logic in just moving over to a system like this. And before we cover a paper written in 1996, I think if you don't have a frame of reference for what things were like in 1996, and hopefully some crypto bros who were born later will really pay attention to what I have to say here, because if you don't have a historical context for what the world was like at this point in time, then you don't understand how revolutionary these lines of thinking actually were, considering that they're coming from the 70s and the 80s. So in 1996, people born on the year this paper is written, like they're significantly older, but like the people who were born in 1985, the first paper, you would now be 40 years old. Okay, so and people born in 1996, they would be what, basically 30 years old. They're 29, 30 years old or whatever. In terms of technology, the internet's domain name system was created in 1996. And the first US release of Windows 1.0 was launched by Microsoft. So January 1st of 1996, the first mobile phone call is made in Britain by Ernie Wise to Vodafone. In September 13th, the Super Mario Brothers game is introduced by Nintendo. October 16th of 1996, Intel introduces the 32-bit, well, they called it the i386 microchip, okay? And I want to hone in on that specifically because if you don't understand the gap in computing technology between now and then, and if you're very young or new to computing systems or whatever, you wouldn't. The microchip, it's all about transistors. Everything else is peripheral to your transistor count. The i386 was the bleeding edge microchip that they were giving to think tanks and universities, and like the top banks would buy like 2 of these because they have to keep up with the bleeding edge of technology. College students used to check out at a library time to use one of these things, and they had to show like a reason why they needed this masterpiece of technology. Well, it had 275,000 transistors in it. And for context, a really nice modern desktop workstation, similar to like the one that I'm talking to you on right now, you might use something like a Ryzen 9 95 or 9950X. So that's like, I have a lot of core counts, I do a lot of computer work, but this is something that you would just buy as a matter of course for your regular home desktop if you use a lot of computers. And that was released in the 15th of August 2024. That has 16,630,000,000 transistors. So, in other words, this bleeding edge computer from 1996 has 1/1000th the transistors that a home computer might have today. Not to mention like what you would be using at the latest Intel research laboratory would just smoke this thing. But what you can just go down to the local tech store and buy and build for yourself today is literally 1,000 orders of magnitude. It's like way beyond that. But the other thing is when a computer is calculating something, you could kind of think of it like how many calculations per second is based on its clock speed. Well, at the bottom end, this i386 would have 12.5 megahertz. And then if you wanted to basically cook a potato in your garage, you could crank it up to 40 megahertz for a couple seconds. The modern, once again, 9950X has a clock speed of 4.3 gigahertz, which a gigahertz is 1,000 megahertz, and has reached clock speeds of 7.44 gigahertz with overclocking, which means that the base clock speed of the i386 was 0.3% of a modern home desktop computer. So this is the context that people need to understand, is the stuff that these people were working with is so much weaker than what just a regular guy has today. And a cell phone call was the bleeding edge of technology, and you had to do it from like outside the building to call inside the building as like a field test of having a cell phone down the line. Well, that is the time that the NSA released the How to Make a Mint paper, which is kind of the centerpiece of what people talk about when they're talking about the history of cryptocurrency. So who wrote the paper remains anonymous, but we know the names of the people who got permission to publish the paper, and there is one author listed. And we discussed it before, but just for posterity's sake, it's Thomas P. Vartanian. And I'm sure because Monero Master is like the greatest editor of all time, he'll show you like, something right now on screen, probably, right? But the How to Make a Mint paper has all of these anonymous authors to it, and which kind of gives it like this nefarious vibe to it or whatever. But so 1996, we're already talking 11 years later than the thing that I read from David Chaum's work, and it's almost 2 decades later than the original pioneering research into cryptocurrency. So we are already talking about a longer time has passed than the life of Bitcoin at this point. 20 years is a long time in the world of technology.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people try to point to How to Make a Mint as this is the beginning of cryptocurrency. No, it's actually less than halfway back for cryptocurrency. I didn't even get a chance to say it, but I think it was like by 1977, everything that you would recognize as a crypto transaction was already being done on ARPANET. And someday I hope that maybe we can dive into all of that too. But I'm trying to just focus on the life and development of just the work of David Chaum specifically, because I think with that context in mind, this cypherpunk who's also kind of living in the world of big government, and he's trying to steer us or at least as far as I can tell. I mean, maybe he's a terrible person, I just don't know. But like everything that I can learn about the man, he seems to be trying to steer the future of humanity into the cypherpunk ethos. Very quiet, very private man. So How to Make a Mint, 5 out of 14 references cited in that paper are references to stuff exclusively written by David Chaum, who also might cite somebody else or may have had a guy editing his paper, but it is entirely the work of David Chaum. 5 out of 14 references. I haven't done all 14, but I think maybe the 4 of that I haven't read, the 4 that I have read that weren't David Chaum, because I've focused on his stuff a lot. All of them cite David Chaum as pretty much their entire body of work. So 3 out of 14 were written by, and this is where I'm not saying it's Satoshi, okay? In fact, personally, I think that it's this guy and David Chaum are Satoshi, all right? I can't prove that. But 3 out of 14 papers cited by the How to Make a Mint document are written by Tatsuki Okamoto. And then David Chaum. So make of that what you will as far as like the history of Satoshi himself. But every paper that I've read from beginning to end other than those 8 heavily cite the work of those 2 people. So effectively, How to Make a Mint is the culmination of work up until that point of those 2 individuals. And it's interesting what is and isn't omitted from their body of work in order to make this paper. And it's not that the NSA, I mean, maybe they did make Bitcoin, maybe, but this is at least a window into what the elite of the technically literate individuals within the NSA, and by extension probably everybody connected to that, because they were passing around work. Now the Patriot Act made it easier for them to do that, but there's plenty of evidence to show that the NSA is sharing information with the CIA, is sharing information with the FBI, even back at this point. And it would be a fool who believes that, they weren't sharing this back and forth. They almost certainly were. Okay. Well, in section 1.2 of the paper How to Make a Mint, you find security of electronic payments. They talk about privacy, user identification, pseudo-anonymity, message integrity. And here's where a really interesting thing that they cover, which you very rarely hear crypto enthusiasts talk about, but it's core to the ethos. non-repudiation. So in other words, the finality of the transaction. So even at this point in time, the government is showing a lot of concern about things like chargebacks or banks not pushing through payments. And I could rabbit trail here right now, but I'm going to resist the temptation only to say that people who think that even, the Luciferian, I'll save the slander for later, but the cabal, we'll call it, is it's not as homogenous as people would like to think. In fact, it reminds me of the Christian community. Like, they spend so much time fighting with each other that you start to ask yourself, when are we going to go attack the enemy, right? Like, do we have time for that too? Do we have time to start fighting the war, or are we just going to keep squabbling? They do the same thing. Unfortunately, I think that they might be a little bit better at focusing on the tyranny and enslavement part than we are on the fighting for the good guys part, at least for right now. The good news is we have Jesus on our side, so we can get away with our litany of failures, at least for now. But under non-repudiation, they have this thing, or protection against later denial of a transaction. And then this quote here is very interesting to me. This is clearly necessary for electronic commerce for such things as digital receipts and payments. So the government is becoming very concerned about chargebacks and denial of payments and all of these other things that we're usually used to the government imposing on us, right? But the government is also very concerned about it for them. And then the last three properties are collectively referred to as authenticity, and it's kind of the beginning of where he's working on the authors of this paper are working on the double spend problem, which then once you get to 1.3, electronic cash, they talk about how payer anonymity during payment and payment untraceability are a serious concern too. I'm going to read this little part here. So that the bank cannot tell whose money is used in a particular payment. So you constantly see people concerned about like this uniting of the banks and the government. Well, obviously in 1996, the government is concerned about banks being aware of every single transaction and their ability to identify who's doing the paying. And then if you start to look at these Davos and World Economic Forum discussions, you notice how the elites and the powers that be are trying to centralize knowledge of that information to these central banks, because at least it's close enough where the government can like grab onto them and rein them in. So the government seems to be very concerned about what the banks do and don't know about your private transactions. So now I'm going to read a little paragraph. It's like a half a paragraph from the electronic cash, and I'll cut it off short here. But these features are not available with credit cards. Indeed, there are only conventional payment systems offering it as cash. Thus, Chaum and others have introduced electronic cash or digital cash, an electronic payment system which offers both features. The sequence of events in an electronic cash payment is as follows. Notice how the authors are referring to David Chaum as though he is not participating in the authorship of this paper. They're only citing his work.
They're also citing him as you could say, as a leader. That he's authoritative. He's an authoritative source on this space.
Yes. So maybe they're good at covering their tracks, and David Chaum did have something to do with writing this paper. Maybe. Or maybe this is the government following the evolution of these things, because this is right in the heat of him launching his own company. And that's one of the reasons why I brought up that David Chaum in 1990, he was making a micropayment system. And from 1995 to 1998, he is in the thick of using eCash amongst these banking cartels. Remember how at the beginning of the show we were talking about what if the internet goes down, right? Mm-hmm. Well, apparently they are not alone in their concerns. because right after 1.4 counterfeiting, which is them going into the double spend problem, and I would love to dive into this if I thought that time would allow for it, but I think if I don't stay on track, it's not gonna go very well for us as far as time constraints and guarding the audience's time. But anybody who's doing this research, don't miss section 1.4 counterfeiting. And the only thing that I want to point out on that is in the section called token forgery and the section called multiple spending, what you have is them solving the double spend problem, which supposedly to Satoshi Nakamoto is the guy who solved the double spend problem. But as you can see, the government is already talking about how it has been solved in these other papers. In 1996, they're confirming that the system actually works as intended in 1996. That's a long time before 2008. So if you get to 2.1 and on, public key cryptographic tools, okay, it builds the bedrock for how hashing works and how signature identification works, which is once again based on papers that are significantly older than all of this information, in order to get to where they break down different protocols and they number them protocol 1, 2, 3, and 4. But I'm going to focus on 3 and 4. Protocol 3 is untraceable online electronic payment, and they go into how it would be withdrawn, how it would be deposited. Now, these guys are writing things in terms of comparing it to the existing banking structure. So, of course, they're going to write it that way, but they're talking about how withdrawals work, how payments work, and how deposits work. Then you get to protocol 4, and this is where things get very, very interesting, because it seems odd to me that people are trying to solve a problem that these guys acknowledge has already been solved by 96. Protocol 4 is called untraceable offline electronic payment. They go over withdrawals, payments, deposits, and so on. And these people point out how eCash already had all of the systems necessary to solve this problem. Well, if you look up eCash today, it doesn't give you a whole, well, I mean, you can find earlier works that talk about David Chaum and some of this other stuff, but eCash today is a bank-owned system that is attempting to solve the offline payment solution. And it is based entirely on the work of David Chaum, having been passed around from company to company. And they are now basically trying to sell you what is effectively a Visa card with a microchip that allows you to make offline payments and some other offline payment solutions. But we're looking at, in this paper, that problem had obviously already been solved, and they were working out the minutia of how they would maintain control over such a solution. So we are in 1996. Well, one guy is making the first cell phone call, and another company is launching a 32-bit x86 microchip. These people are talking about the future that we are moving into right now, as though all of these problems have already been solved. So those listening who don't have their historical frame of reference, those listening who don't understand that this is a spiritual war that goes back to ancient history. It is a battle between tyranny and freedom. And freedom is found in Jesus Christ. And if you don't understand that, then you're not even on the right team. Maybe you do agree with me, maybe you don't, but you can take that up with Jesus. Either way, above my pay grade. We are not saying here that Monero is the solution to all of the world's financial problems, but what I am saying is advocates for freedom have been advocating for something like Monero since 1982. And we have it available to us today. And it kind of reminds me of somebody who they might be building a building, but they refuse to use a hammer. It's to take tools out of your tool bag at a time like this is not a good idea. You don't want to show up to a gunfight with just a knife. You don't want to fight for economic freedom without a solid cryptocurrency under your tool belt. And if David Chaum, the guy who invented all of this stuff, is telling you what he knows, you should probably listen, because here it is for everybody to see.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Old Testament, where Moses lays out the law, the covenant for the Israelites, saying, "Choose whom this day you will serve." God, the peace, prosperity, blessing, or Satan, right?
Yeah.
Enslavement, and these two options are before us today. Jesus clearly said there's two roads: there's the narrow way, which is difficult, which leads to life, and there's the broad way, which is easy, which leads to destruction. So thank you, Alaskanon, for going through the history. I think you've opened up or you've kind of highlighted a lot of threads for people to pull. We'll include links in the show notes if you want to do a deep dive in this. It might even be worthwhile trying to reach out to Dave and seeing if we could get him on the show and to discuss these things in great detail. But overall, I think it's important that Christians know that there are alternatives and also know where this is going. And if you can plot out what their weapon is, then all you have to do is invert it, and you've got the kind of counterforce to that. So if surveillance is their goal, well, then privacy is your defense, and so on and so forth. And likewise, if this is wrapped up in a satanic enslavement, well, then Christian liberty is the path that we need to be pursuing.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you want to finish up with, wrap up? Now would be a time.
God is the author of all things that have ever been created, and the devil's trend seems to be to poison the things that God's created. And I think the deeper I dig into this stuff, the more I realize that a freedom-minded currency was the goal of its inventors. And there are certainly people trying to poison the well. There are certainly people trying to use these tools for nefarious purposes. But it is my opinion that the origins of these things are actually to our benefit. And it is us who are failing to preserve our freedom and preserve God's will for us. And we cannot roll over and die to this. Another big area in this space right now is large language models, and maybe that's a rabbit trail for another time. But one of the things that I see people doing a lot with this stuff is burying their head in the sand. And God is not, he wouldn't have you be ignorant, he often says. But more importantly, he wouldn't have you be afraid. Basically, every time he sends a messenger, he says, don't be afraid. And what could you possibly be afraid of with God on your side? What could you possibly be afraid of with Jesus leading the charge right now? So if you find yourself staying ignorant to these topics or being afraid of these topics, you already know where that comes from, because it's not the big man. And you should challenge that fear, and you should fight for a better world for the people that are coming after you. We could all use a little more Jesus-y behaviors in our life. So that's where I would leave it.
Well, Alaskanon, thank you. That was very insightful. I really appreciate you jumping on, and I'll include links in the show notes for people to connect with you. Until next time, let's keep on fighting the good fight and destroying the works of the devil.
God bless you all, listening audience.